You are listening to the podcast series of the Forum on Central and Eastern Europe of KU Leuven. In our 20-minute conversations, we discuss the latest academic research on the region. I am Kris van Heuckelom, and in today's episode, I have the privilege and the opportunity to talk to Emilia Kledzik, who has come to us from Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, Poland, where she works as a professor of literary and cultural comparative studies. Apart from that, she's also the editor-in-chief of the Poznań-based journal in comparative studies Porównania, Comparisons. Professor Kledzik's academic interests include post-89 Polish literature, post-colonial studies, and Romani studies. Her most recent book came out in 2023 and bears the Polish title Perspektywa poety, Cyganologia Jerzego Ficowskiego, which can be translated in English as Jerzy Ficowski's Gypsyology. In 2024, she wrote an essay for the edited volume Tears of Blood, a poet's witness account of the Nazi genocide of Roma, which contains a long poem by the Romani poet Papusza, Bronisława Weiss, who survived the German occupation and the Second World War in Volhynia, currently Ukraine. Welcome to Leuven, Emilia, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation for a conversation on your past and ongoing research. Let's start from your most recent monograph, an impressive book of almost 700 pages that critically looks into Jerzy Ficowski's Cyganologia, Gypsyology. Who was Jerzy Ficowski and why is he such an important figure in the development of the Polish branch of Romani studies?
Well, thank you, Kris. Thank you for this brilliant introduction. So, Jerzy Ficowski was definitely one of the most important poets of post-war period in Poland. He was born in 1924, the same year as Zbigniew Herbert and Tadeusz Różewicz. They were born in 1924 as well, a couple of months after Wisława Szymborska, but actually he didn't get that strong recognition comparable with the one by Herbert and Różewicz. Well, it is kind of difficult to attribute his work to any poetic trend. I would say that his poetry explored margins of society and also natural world. He was therefore also fascinated by cultures of Polish minorities, Jewish and Roma minorities. And for the Polish Roma studies, he was the author of the most, recognized and important book on Romani studies in the 20th century. The title of the book was Polish Gypsies, Cyganie Polscy. The book was first published in 1953, and then it was several times republished, reformulated, and it still is the most popular book on the Roma issues in Poland. He was believed to be the first researcher in Polish Roma studies who actually traveled with the Roma community. And he was also believed that during his wandering with Roma people, he discovered the genius poet Bronisława Weiss Papusza, and later on he published her poetry in his translation.
And was his interest in Romani culture also reflected in his creative output as a writer? Because you were referring to this book on Cyganie Polscy, but did it also come back in his poetry?
He was more like an enthusiast of, as I said, those minority cultures. And himself, he was not a researcher. He'd never graduated from any university studies. So he got fascinated with Romani culture during the Second World War when he witnessed Roma suffering in Warsaw Ghetto. And then he wanted to write poetry on, as I said, the situation of Roma. But the political situation in Poland changed dramatically, and there was also this state campaign, which was specially designed for the Roma community, which was planned to be an action of settlement, of so-called forced settlement and productivization of Roma community, and Jerzy Ficowski became involved in this action. So as a part of this action, he also wrote some poems, in this ideological mood of socialism at the beginning of the 50s. But I would say that during his very long poetic career, Roma people were always very important topic for him. He was also exploring the linguistic way of excluding Roma communities from our language, from our community. So he was interested in the figures that we built in our language to exclude Roma community. And at the same time, I think he was very much fascinated with this romantic view of Roma people wandering and free people who have their roots in India, so have this exotic culture. So this can also be seen in his poetry.
So you were referring to the Second World War and the Holocaust. One of the chapters of your book is devoted to Ficowski's involvement in early research on the predicament of Romani people during the Second World War and the Holocaust. What was Ficowski's actual role in this field, and what was the impact of his work?
During the Second World War, when he was a teenager, he witnessed Roma people suffering in multiple ways, especially in the Warsaw Ghetto. After the war, he got involved in the so-called Main Commission for Investigation of German Nazi crimes. This was an institution designed to investigate crimes committed by the Nazis in Poland. So he worked as a researcher, although he was not one. He collected accounts of witnesses, and I would say that he worked as a very progressive historian, because European nations recognized Roma Holocaust as Roma Holocaust in the 80s, right? And Ficowski had this intuition that it has this potential to be problematized this way in the 50s or even in the 40s. At the same time, he was very strongly encouraged by another very famous Polish Jewish poet, Julian Tuwim, to write a book on the culture and folk heritage of Roma people in Poland. And he also wanted to write his own novel on Roma people, so he was involved in multiple activities connected to the Polish Roma. But answering your question, he had this very progressive way of thinking that what happened to the Roma people during the Second World War was not because they were asocial people or criminals, but this was a Holocaust. It's the same way the Jewish people experienced it. Unfortunately, he had no scientific skills, so he was not really able to work with this very sensitive material. He collected witnesses' accounts, very often produced or mentioned controversial things, like, for example, he discussed question of anti-Zyganism among Jewish community. His Jewish witnesses mentioned something which is in this mood of anti-Zyganism. Ficowski decided to cut it out, and you never do it with witnesses' accounts. The thing is that he was not able to work with it, so his report for this main commission was never published. And a good question would be, what would have happened if the report was published in the 50s, right? I don't know how to answer this question, because there are several political elements in here, but my intuition is that if the report would have been published in the 50s, it probably had fastened our knowledge about Roma Holocaust, right? Or the recognition of Roma Holocaust.
The best known aspect of Ficowski's involvement in the study of Romani culture is the work he has done to promote the work of the already mentioned poet Bronisława Weiss, also known as Papusza. Who was Papusza?
She is known as the best Romani poet of the 20th century, the most famous one. And she was born in Volhynia, in the Lublin region, actually, in 1908. And she was traveling with her family among the Volhynia region in the pre-war and also during the Second World War time. So together with her family, she experienced the cruelties, and she was in this very dangerous place, probably one of the most dangerous places in Europe at this time, in the 40s in Volhynia. So she not only experienced the Nazi genocide, she also experienced Ukrainian-Polish ethnic cleansing. At the end of the 40s, she met Jerzy Ficowski, who was a part of this main commission looking for witnesses. So she and her family told the story of being in Volhynia in the 40s to Jerzy Ficowski, and then he realized that he has someone really gifted there, and he encouraged her to write down her poems and send those poems to him in letters. And after he published first poems by her, and also there was an interview at the beginning of the 50s together with Julian Tuwim, when he told the story of Papusza and her family traveling around the regained territories, unable to find a proper place to stay. So when she became a public person, her career really launched, and Ficowski again published several volumes of her poetry, which were not very friendly accepted by her own community. And this was the problem, because this was, as I mentioned, the time of this so-called state settlement action. So an action which was designed by the communist Polish state for the Roma people to settle down, find proper work, and get some medical health care. But Roma people felt that it was a kind of offensive action against them. So when Papusza became a part of this action, because Ficowski published her poems that were very enthusiastic against this action, Papusza was banned from her own community. And she also had some serious health problems. She was hospitalized many times due to her mental illness. And so the doctors discouraged her from further writing. So most of her poems were written in the 50s, and then after all republished by Jerzy Ficowski also in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 90s. And in the 90s, after the transformation, after the political breakthrough, her poems were translated into multiple languages like Swedish, Japanese, English, German. So she became internationally known as a very gifted Roma poet.
As you meticulously illustrate in your book, Papusza's public and artistic profile as a Romani poet has been heavily filtered by Ficowski's work as an editor and as a translator. What kind of strategies did he apply as the main inspirer and initiator of the so-called Papusza legend?
First of all, those poems were originally longer. And the amount of text that Ficowski used from Papusza's manuscripts, as I said, Papusza wrote her poems in letters and sent it later to Jerzy Ficowski. So the amount of text that Ficowski used ranges from 10% to, say, 80%. Sometimes it's 100%. Sometimes, especially in those later volumes from the 70s, the range of changes, it's so large that it's almost impossible to assess the percentage or to find the proper passage in Papusza's letters. So you cannot actually assess the percentage of Papusza's authorship. Ficowski, first of all, made those poems much shorter. Secondly, he selected some passages and he cut it into verses and stanzas. He very strongly structured the composition, added rhymes and modified many stylistic figures, and in most cases add a title of his own. Well, I would say that the poetry by Papusza is much more complicated than presented by Ficowski, because the edition and translation by Jerzy Ficowski is very much in line with this Roma stereotype we are familiar with from many, many ethnographic books. And the fragments Ficowski chose to underline Papusza's identity were in line with this, let's say, gypsy stereotype. So there were nothing about the, let's say, modern way of living. Papusza wrote in her letters that she, traveled with trains and lived in flats. And Ficowski's accounts, it's always in the woods and it's always traveling with a caravan, right? So he wanted to stress and underline this traditional way of living and the way that is in line with our vision of how the Roma people live. He also blurred this very traditional genre, which is gila in Romani. Gila in Romani is a song, a speech addressed to some audience, and Papusza designed her poetry as a kind of gila. So she always imagined a kind of audience listening to her. It is very oral. It is very performative. It contains some customary idioms like wishes for luck, happiness, money. Ficowski decided to cut it out. From today's perspective, he just blurred this very unique character of this poetry to make it more recognizable by broad readers.
In your book, you also discuss Ficowski's work as an amateur ethnographer against a background of international developments. How does he fit into the larger framework of the development of Romani studies as a discipline, also on the international level?
This is the reason why Ficowski is so well recognized, and his book is still one of the most popular books on Roma poetry, Roma culture in Poland. Because in Polish language, before Ficowski, we didn't have such a book. That is kind of a monography that sums up the whole elements of Roma history, culture, heritage, literature, the diversity of the Roma community, and so on. So in the Western societies, like in Germany, in German states, in Austro-Hungarian Empire, there were plenty of those books telling majority society who Roma are, where they come from, what is their history, what is their culture, and so on. In Poland, although the Roma community is not that big. Today it's around 20,000, and it was the same after the Second World War. People are actually willing to know more about Roma community, and therefore this book was a kind of useful one because it has, 400 pages, and it sums up all the interesting issues on Roma community. The problem is that Ficowski was believed to be the first researcher in Poland to actually travel with Roma communities and to get this knowledge about their culture and history directly from them. And what those letters I discovered and I researched for my monograph show is that, in fact, there were no real field research in Ficowski's career. The one and only meeting with Papusza's family was around, 2 weeks long, and it was the only one meeting. So actually the opinion that Ficowski gained his knowledge from Roma people themselves is a kind of legend, a myth, that is repeated constantly when it comes to Ficowski as a Roma researcher. So the question arises, where did he take his knowledge from? And basically he took it from the older books, right? So he read perfectly in German, in English. He was a member of Gypsy Law Society, so the oldest association that works with Roma culture from the 19th century. He also published 2 of his articles in a journal of this Gypsy Law Society. So I would say that at the turn of 40s and 50s, he became a real Roma researcher at this time. He wanted to be recognized as one in the international society. But coming back to the broader view, in the western part of Europe, we had this kind of criticism against this old traditional way of researching Roma cultures. Traditional way, like writing one book on all aspects on Roma communities. And it happened in the 70s and went on through the 80s and 90s that new ways of researching Roma communities were introduced. And in Poland and also in the, let's say, the post-Soviet bloc, we had only this old kind of research. So answering your question, I would say that Ficowski's book might seem very outdated when you compare it with today's research in Germany or in France, but it is still valid and very often quoted in Poland. So I think that it was kind of necessary to put this book in its historical context.
Your research on Ficowski has been heavily debated in Poland over the past few years, not the least the critical stance you take on his work as an ethnographer, editor, and translator. How do you look back at the controversies surrounding your book and your research?
Jerzy Ficowski is surrounded by a legend of an altruist poet who bound his life to the Roma community. It is sustained and is very much cherished by this circle of people who are connected with Ficowski's family, his friends and poets, critics. So their bafflement is kind of understandable. They sometimes even declare very openly that since they are friends with Ficowski's family, they are not allowed to cooperate with me anymore. But what is really surprising to me is that I've been criticized only for, let's say, ethical positions. One of the Polish critics and translators, Jerzy, called my research publicly and on Facebook shameful and disgraceful, which caused a huge wave of hate speech in social media against me. So what's surprising is that there was no substantial criticism, only the emotional one. But on the other hand, the book was recognized by a large academic society and was nominated to several prizes, and I got plenty of very enthusiastic reviews and also words of support and solidarity. So I think there is, however, a sad lesson to be learned from this story, because as we see, debunking myths always requires a great load of resilience.
Could you tell us something about your research plans for the near and the more distant future? Do you plan to chart new territory, or will you stay in the field of Romani studies?
I have a feeling that I need a rest after what happened last year. But I definitely would like to stay with working with Roma literature. And what's really fascinating is this account of Volhynia massacre you mentioned at the beginning, still not published in Polish. It is published in English and in Romani language and various versions, but it's not published in Polish. So what I'm working on now is to write perhaps a small book even on this fascinating text of this of the way Papusza experienced Volhynia massacre and what this text can tell us as a majority society. I'm a comparative studies researcher, so I'm open to new ideas. And, I think that it's also a time to start a new chapter and to perhaps stay with promoting Polish literature around Europe and around the world.
Which we are doing today.
That's right.
Thank you so much for being with us, Emilia, and for sharing your thoughts and insights on Jerzy Ficowski, Papusza, and the current state of Romani studies in Central and Eastern Europe and Europe at large.
Thank you very much.